It's the final of the Grand Chess Tour. Liren against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and we're going to take a look at their second classical game, and this was a wonderful performance. We'll take a look at the game a little bit later. Let's just have a quick reminder of how the players got there. So Liren defeated Levon Aronian in one semi-final, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave defeated Magnus Carlsen. Not in the classical games, but Maxime got the edge in the rapid and blitz phase. So anyway, we're into the finals. This is their second classical game. Ding probably should have won the first one, played extremely well. So anyway, we go into the second classical game. Ding with the white pieces. Now he starts with the English, and I think this is directed against Vachier-Lagrave's Grunfeld. So here we go. It's gone into a symmetrical English. Now, there's no engagement between the forces at this stage. And that means that the really complex fight is deferred to later on. And, you know, here's a big moment where Black can either play with knight f6, d6, and continue the symmetry. But no, Maxime decides to play e5, playing this so-called Botvinnik system, with the pawns on c5 and e5. So that's an aggressive setup, and it has a good reputation. Let's see how things develop. So a3, looking perhaps to get in b4. But Maxime squashes that idea straight away with a5. This is typical of this Botvinnik system, that these pawns serve to clamp White's pawn break. So obviously no chance of d4 and b4 prevented as well. But of course these pawn advances leave big gaps here. And, you know, that's obviously a factor in the position. So rook b1. Well, good to get that rook off the long diagonal before you play a move like b3. Otherwise, there would be the possibility to play e4. So rook b8. Now, that's an interesting move because, in fact, Black has the chance to play b5 here because White often wants to put the knight in on d5. So no pieces exchanged yet. So that means, as I said, that the real fight is deferred to later on in the game, and we got a really good fight. Watch out for this. So knight d2. So Ding starts to take control over these squares. Very important, particularly the d5 square, because after bishop e6 here, Black already threatens to break with d5 and just get a big space advantage. So it's important that White puts the knight in on d5 to prevent that. But in playing this move, that means that Black can now break with d5. So around about this point, it looks as though Maxime's setup has been extremely successful. But Ding was very patient. e3. Queen d7 still looks very nice for Black. I've played these kind of systems as Black, and you're playing a kind of global system here. You know, sometimes it feels like you can actually make good progress on the queen side, but very often you can try and exchange off these bishops and actually turn your attention to the king side as well. So it's very complex strategy, actually. Now Ding plays rook e1 here. So that means that if the bishop comes here, he wants to avoid an exchange, which is controversial in itself. Well, more on that a little bit later. But first of all, bishop g4. And here is where Black can go to play for the attack. I should say Maxime played here rook c8 But you could exchange on d5, and white plays a4 to try and gain control over this square, and then bishop h3. So you just turn your attentions to the kingside. Obviously that's involves some compromise on this side of the board, because white will take and put a knight on c4 and go for this a pawn. That's one way of playing. Another way of playing here is perhaps to close the queen side with b4, although that seems counterintuitive. But that would prevent white from creating a weakness on the queen side. I mean, white has moves against that one as well, but you know, that would be, with hindsight, that might be a good option. But let's have a look at this. So the game, rook c8, knight e4. So watch out for a big thumping fork here. So that forces black's hand. Has to take now, and the knight drops back. So be careful, the threat here. So the knight comes back to d2, and the bishop protects the pawn. So that little shuffling, who's gained from that? Well, we saw this position earlier, but I don't know how well placed the rook is on c8. In the position where I exchanged earlier on d5, you notice that rook was on f8 there, which is in the right position for advancing the f-pawn potentially. So I'm not quite sure what the rook is doing on c8. Anyway, bishop h3 from Vachier-Lagrave. Well, here Ding decides to put the bishop on h1, which looks very strange with that bishop cutting across white's king. Quite a contentious decision. White could just play with e4 here, protecting this pawn. And after the exchange, of course, black will try to attack on the king side. And we have a very tense position where you can see these pawns advancing, but white will exchange here and try to attack these pawns. Very difficult to assess what's going on there. But Ding avoided that. He played the bishop to h1. So he still wants to go for this a4 idea, and knight c4. But let's see how things work out. Knight f5. So that knight starting to loom on the king side. a4. So this is a really important move for white to try and gain some counterplay. So we're going to see this pawn is going to be knocked out, and the knight will come into c4 to attack these pawns. And now h5. By the way, if black avoids that, tries to keep it close with b4 here, then knight c4 is very annoying, keeping an eye on those pawns. And black does not want to consign the queen to such menial duties, defending mere pawns. So Vachier-Lagrave goes for it on the king side. h5. So Ding exchanged and played rook a1. So you can see this is the target. Now black also has a target here on b3, which creates extra complications. h4. Bishop c3. So there's a clear division in this position between white's ambitions to take that a-pawn and black's ambitions to try and break through on the king side. Rook a8. So the rook comes over to defend that pawn. And now rook a4. Matters aren't so clear because that rook covers a lot of squares along the fourth rank. And at this point, I've got to say, it feels like Ding is starting to take control, because with black's rooks stuck over on the queen side, it's very hard to imagine how his king side attack is actually going to have any force at all. Yes, these pieces certainly look pretty good, and sometimes even the bishop as well, but White's communications are pretty good, particularly with that rook along the 4th rank, and the queen can come over to defend the kingside as well. Okay, let's see how things play out. Queen d8, giving more protection to this pawn, but also just coming onto this avenue towards the kingside as well. So tricky. And now bishop f3. Now this is the first stage in a very clever idea from Ding. Rook b8. Keep an eye on that pawn. Rook a1. A bit more pressure here. But not so clear. Bishop h6. And the start of threats to this pawn. And this, well, it is very risky to take here. Black could certainly look at the possibility of sacrificing here, and with the queen following up, this is extremely dangerous. So understandably, Ding decided, okay, I'll put the rook back. So looks like he's lost time, but actually it's very difficult for black to achieve anything here because these rooks are stymied. They're not breaking through with the knight protecting the pawn, and the king side is actually pretty secure. Queen g5 looks very dangerous, but actually the knight just knocks the queen backwards. Now rook a3 defends the pawn. Knight back to e7 attacks this pawn, so the knight moves back. So there's a lot of repetition here, and black's knight moves back. So Ding, well, he obviously feels he's better here, and I think we can see that because these rooks, as I said, aren't going anywhere. But it's difficult to arrange his pieces so that he can go for the a pawn. But let's see what he does here. So queen d1. This is the start of a very useful little shuffle, as we'll see. This is actually a very, very clever move. And Maxime can't do anything really, bishop back. And now Ding starts to take the initiative. g4 knocks back the knight, and now king h1. So he's intending putting that rook on g1, securing the pawn, possibly even looking at advancing and maybe going after this pawn. But in any case, the rook on g1 just holds the king side, and you can see with the knight on h6, well, it doesn't look very good. I mean, one possibility might simply be to play rook g1, and if black does nothing, then it's possible to target the a pawn. So Vachier-Lagrave decides, well, he doesn't want this knight to be sidelined, and indeed that bishop could be in some danger as well. So he opens with f5. This was taken, and then rook g1. So this is nice. King h1 certainly brings dividends. The rook looking down the open file, but still at this moment you think, well, it certainly doesn't look too bad for black. Maybe the g4 square can be used, and white's pieces aren't, well, looking too menacing on the king side, not yet at any rate. Queen e2, there's a careful little move, but there are interesting possibilities coming now. Rook a4. So that's sweeping across the 4th rank. Now, if, let's see, bishop g4 blocking these out, then it's possible just to take this pawn. And if queen d8 to protect that one, then white will play bishop h5, put the bishop on g6, and then the queen follows up by coming to h5, and, well, suddenly black's position is in dire straits. So here we go, rook a4 just played. So rook takes b3. Now if that rook is taken, then this rook drops, and, well, basically black has counterplay there. But that wasn't his intention. After rook takes, Ding just took on h4. Well, now we can see that White's pieces are starting to look more menacing on the king side with the two rooks here. It's so interesting how Ding switches sides. So this bishop drops and this one drops. A4. So how dangerous is this pawn? How dangerous is White's kingside attack? Let's see. E4. This feels so slow. But let's see. Rook C2, a pin. Rook H5. Basically White's intention is to take here. So watch this. If Rook B2, which looks pretty nasty, you take. And Queen E3 with devastating threats here on the king side. That will be checkmate. So we can see that move played ages ago, that little shuffle of the queen round to E2. Basically Ding was starting to position that queen over towards the king side, and in this variation you can see how it all comes together. Now maybe, I'm sure he hadn't seen that exact variation, but he was already preparing E4, so I think he knew what he was about. Anyway, Rook H5 played. Threat to take this pawn. So Vachier-Lagrave closes with F4. Queen D1, stepping out of that pin. Now, what happens if this rook moves back? Well, this bishop just crawls in. Like this, and then rook takes G7. Once that's taken, then the queen will come over and this one will drop. Basically, it's going to be mate. So Queen D1 played, Rook BB2, which looks really menacing, but Knight C4 attacks the rook. A3. So White has to be very careful here. Bishop G4 hits the queen, which drops back. So that rook is taken. You've got to recapture with the rook. And now Bishop E6. It reminds me of a Kasparov game, actually. Kasparov against Smirin from a long time ago, which also featured rooks and a bishop on E6 and a queen following after a rook as well. So A2. Okay, we've reached the decisive moment in the game. Either black is going to land here, exchange rooks, get a queen, or white is going to crash through on the king side. Ding to play. Rook takes bishop. Okay, quick look at what happens after rook b1. This did not happen. But let's see. Rook back. Threatening mate with rook takes knight. Queen defends the knight. Queen g4. Queen. And now this is mate. Ding is deadly around the king. So rook takes bishop. King takes. Queen g1 check. And rook f5. That was the final move of the game. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave resigned in this position. Why did he resign? Well, if knight takes rook, queen g8 and queen f7 is checkmate. Now that is just a deadly finish. That's what I like about Ding Liren's play. He played a very strategic game, actually, but he always has a very keen eye for attacking his opponent's king, and his judgment was absolutely superb here. Of course, he would have calculated these final stages exactly, but just before then, if we go back to, let's say, this position, he will have had to have judged that he would be in time here. And yeah, his instinct was absolutely superb. So with that win, Ding has now a commanding lead in the final of the Grand Chess Tour. They now go into a rapid and blitz phase, so it's not over yet, and Maxime is very good, of course, in blitz and rapid, but Ding looking good so far. Thanks for watching.